Hi, everybody. I'm John McLaughlin. Welcome again for another one of our Warrior Wednesday segments, and a really special guest today. Last week we had Stephen Williford on, and another, we'll call them of the Texas heroes, guys that have actually been involved in real gunfights and can use what they learned to help the rest of us as Second Amendment folks and self-defenders. So, Greg, first of all, welcome, and just give us I know you're, I'll call it semi-retired now, retired once, but still doing a little LE work out there.
Well, yep, John, thank you for having me on. I appreciate the invitation. I'm honored to be asked to participate and have a conversation here. Yeah, a little bit about me. I retired at the end of August in 2018 from the Garland Police Department. I had just over 40 years there when I retired. Spent my whole career in a uniform on the street because that's what I love doing. That was policing for me. I had opportunities to do other things and promote and do some of those things, but you know, I just couldn't figure out why I wanted to leave something I loved doing to do something I wasn't sure if I'd like it or not. And maybe that's a little bit of not being willing to jump both feet in the fire, but nonetheless, I did enjoy and love what I was doing. So spent nearly 28 of my 40 years on a motorcycle. I really enjoyed that duty and did a myriad of other things. I was SWAT team negotiator, and I was a team leader for the negotiators at one point, on call for a number of things, was a traffic fatality investigator. So I had a very interesting career, and and it was all street work, but that was okay. And then after retirement, I was retired about 3 months, and then hired back on part-time with the city marshal's office. Not so much because I just couldn't stand not working, but I really struggled with walking away from the people I had spent 40 years with and not having the opportunity to run into them and see them and visit with them. And so that opportunity presented itself, and I worked a couple of days a week, and come to find out, really keeping my finger in that pie has been pretty psychologically helpful, I think, too. It's just kind of part of who I am, you know?
Right. Well, I get it. I was 31 years at the same job. I did TV meteorology. I did all kinds of radar stuff. Also flew helicopters, and that was my connection to Garland, Texas, of all things. There's a nice helicopter operator in Garland called Sky Helicopters, and I actually would go down there and pick up news helicopters flying back to Iowa or back and forth. So I know the area at least a little bit and kind of keep an eye on things down there when the bad weather rolls in your way. Yeah,
well, it's the helipad was kind of an interesting thing when it came to fruition here in Garland. There were a lot of raised eyebrows, like, why in the world would we want a heliport? And what would we do with that thing?
Right.
But it's turned out to be quite an entity, and you know, our DPS partners, they use it, and news people, the medical people, because they can hot fuel there, apparently is a term for it, where they don't have to shut down and everything. They can hot fuel and move on. So yeah, it's turned out to be quite an asset here, and it's right on the border of Garland and Dallas. It's in Garland, but it's right near the border, so it's very centrally located as well.
Yeah, very familiar. So I'm involved in what's called the Iowa Firearms Coalition. I know you're going to be coming to speak to us before too long, so we appreciate that. And our big thing is, you know, we have our rights. We've got the Second Amendment, and we're doing everything we can in Iowa to protect that. But I like to say that we have just a very high moral obligation that if we're going to carry a firearm, that we have a strong basis of training that goes along with that. And I know you've been a proponent of that. And just kind of go into a little bit of your career, the training you got, and how that helped you on that horrible day in 2015.
Well, first of all, the Garland Police Department has, and now remember, I started in 1978 is when I started the police academy in May of 1978. So it's a long time ago. And Garland was about half the size that it is now. Sure. But Garland has always been, even back then, was looked upon as a rather progressive department and a very proactive policing department rather than reactive. And they've always had a strong sense of training and and more training than is required by the state. The training requirements that I had to go through were significantly more than the state mandated. So the department in itself, the attitude there has always been strong toward more is good, more is better when it comes to training. And so I kind of grew up in that mindset, and it really made a lot of sense. And the reality of how much sense it made really came to life May 3rd, 2015 at the Curtiss Culwell Center. And so all that time, that all the training that I had done, and I'm not talking about just firearms training, I'm talking about defensive tactics, I'm talking about dealing with mental health issues, in interrogating, any number of things, report writing, for crying out loud. There was always an emphasis on training through the department. And then a real eye opener for me too was my motorcycle training. SWAT training and motorcycle training, both of those were very much eye openers for the value of training, but even more importantly, the value of practicing what you're trained to do.
Right.
Getting the training is just the first step. It's not the step, it's the first step. And the motorcycle training, we used to go to the motor, like I said, I spent nearly 28 years on motors, and once a month we went to the practice field and we rode cone patterns and practiced emergency braking and over and over and over again. And what was really interesting and what was very demonstrative for me was the first 15 or 20 minutes of that training day, when I'd go ride in the cone patterns or whatever we were doing, I was a little rusty. And it shows how fast those skills deteriorate. Now, the longer I was on motors, the less amount of time those skills were subpar. They came back up in a hurry. But by the same token, if you don't go out there and practice and train, those skills are all perishable. They go away. And it's all about muscle memory, whether it's firearms or motorcycle riding or jogging or whatever the heck you're doing,
Right.
And I don't know any discipline that involves any kind of, high cognitive load and, fine motor skills that if you get away from it for a few weeks or a month, that the rust hasn't already started to set in. So in the science world, we call that myelination of neural pathways, where you're practicing something the proper way over and over, so that when the moment of need arises, there's not that delay, like, oh, what do I do? It's already there just instantly.
Right. Well, and, the old expression, practice makes perfect, is kind of close, but really perfect practice makes perfect. You got to practice correctness, because you can practice the wrong thing and get really good at that too.
Yeah.
So,
and unlearning that takes a lot longer than just doing it right the first time.
Yeah, I think you're right there.
So let's get into, first of all, a little bit of situational awareness and what you would say for the self-defender out there carrying a firearm. I've read all the books, Left of Bang and things like that. What should the average self-defender that's carrying a firearm with either concealed carry, or like Texas and Iowa now, we are constitutional carry. What's your advice for those folks?
Well, first of all, you have to be very aware. One of the first things you need to be most aware of is that you're carrying a handgun or a weapon, and where it is, how you're carrying it, is it safe on your person, all those kinds of things. I know that sounds kind of rudimentary, but the reality is it's critical. It's kind of like the foundation of a building. You don't have a good foundation, the whole thing's coming down, right? So the first thing that I would be concerned about is making sure that you're aware that you've got it, where you've got it, and if you need to retrieve it, how you're going to do that. And so beyond that, the training is important. The situational awareness, people have got to become more cognizant of what's around them, who's around them, how close they are around them, what's going on around them, all those things. And, we beat that into our policemen's heads as much as we can to be situationally aware.
Right.
When you see that patrol car rolling around, hopefully it's not just aimlessly driving. I hope,
Right.
you hope the guy's got some idea. He's doing something while he's out there driving around. He may not be going a particular route or whatever, but what he's doing is he's just taking it all in. And if he sees something that shoots up a red flag, then he reacts to it. As a self-defender, you're not looking to go out there and find a mess to get into. That is kind of the opposite of what you're wanting to do.
Yes.
If you're wanting to avoid that if you can, and that situational awareness, by knowing what's going on around you, can be helpful in doing exactly that. Because the last thing you want to do is get involved in a confrontation you didn't need to get involved in, and because that never ends good.
Yeah, best way to avoid a gunfight is to avoid a gunfight, right?
Exactly. Go the other way if you can.
Yep.
But situational awareness is just about not just putting your here a great example of that is how many kids do you see walking down the street with their earbuds in, looking down at their phone, and they'll walk right across, right out into traffic if they're with unthinkingly. Well, obviously they're not situationally aware of anything, and as a defender, we don't have that luxury. We got to be paying attention to what's going on around us at all times. I've even told my family, if you look up and you see the same car too many times, or you see the same face more times than is usual, notice that, and don't think that you're being crazy or paranoid. Right. Just be cautious about it, because that could mean something.
Yeah,
and
the gift of fear is a real thing. When something doesn't feel right, when you get that spidey sense going, pay attention to that. Yeah, I raised my kids back in the day on Colonel Cooper's color code. I'm sure you're familiar with that, with condition white, and then you ramp your way up. And so when I took my kids to the store or parking lot, sporting events, they're like, "Dad, look at all these people, condition white. They're not paying attention. They're not familiar with their surroundings." And it was almost like a game. And then you could almost tell the people that had some like law enforcement training, or guys that were squared away with concealed carry, like, okay, I know that guy's carrying, but he's looking around, he's aware of his surroundings, and it almost is like a game, but it actually was very helpful. Well,
like I said, if you're not aware of what's going on around you, one, you're not going to be prepared to defend yourself or somebody else if that need arises, and you're also not going to be prepared to get out of a difficult situation that you can avoid, which would be the preferable tactic to take. Is to stay away from it if you can reasonably.
Let's talk spiritual fitness for a little bit. I know that's something close to your heart. We have to be prepared for the day, and you had a good outcome, you prevailed, but there's not a guarantee that we're going to win a fight, so we need to be ready just in case. So tell me a little bit about that and the role of faith in your life.
Well, I'm not a theologian by any means, but I am a man of faith, and I believe God puts us in places on purpose. I'm not a big believer in coincidences. Right. I have some interesting stories about that. Some of them related to what happened at the Culwell Center after the fact, and so on. If for me, I don't think I could have done 40 years of law enforcement without faith as a pillar of that foundation. It's got to be kind of a cornerstone for me. And I, every day that I went to work, I made sure that that things were right at home. I made sure that things were right in my heart, and that the chance actually really did exist that when I said goodbye, that might be the goodbye. And I was okay with that because I knew what the outcome for me in my spiritual life was. And if that were God's will, then I was good with that. If something happened and I went and got to sit on, in front of the throne and see the face of Jesus, you think I really wanted to come back to Garland, Texas? Probably not.
The way
You
things
know what
are
I'm
getting
saying?
these days, I sometimes hope that sooner than later.
But by the same token, certainly, I love my family and I wanted to be home and my friends, and
Right.
and I wanted that time. I loved the time here on earth, and I've got lots of things that I'd like to be able to accomplish, and faith is a big part of that. I mean, you've got to, like I said, I think God has plans for us, and I obviously haven't gotten it all done yet because I'm still here. But
Yeah.
I think when I get all my stuff done, that's when I'll get the opportunity to go home and be with the Lord.
Well, talk a little bit about resiliency and how faith plays into that. I know Colonel Grossman talks about that a lot. I've been involved in the media. I've seen horrible things, but personally, my faith has helped me get through a lot of those traumatic events. And I think without that, it kind of stacks the odds against us. So, your opinion on that?
Well, yeah, in a 40-year career, I saw a lot of trauma, and I spent 33 of my 40 years, the last 33 years of my career, I was in the traffic division. Like I said, I was on motors most of that, and then the tail end, I was in a traffic car. But for the entirety of those 33 years, I was a special investigator for fatality crashes. So I was one of the guys they called out. If we had a near fatality or a fatality crash, I was one of the guys that got called out to investigate that. Got some special training, of course, for all that. But and as a consequence of that, I saw a lot of pretty traumatic stuff. I saw a lot of pretty gruesome things and very sad things. The worst part of my job that I had, and people have asked me, that question, what's the worst thing that you ever did as a police or had to do as a policeman? Well, the hardest thing was going to tell some mom and dad their 15-year-old kid just got killed in a car wreck.
Yep.
I mean, there's no good way to do that. It's heart-wrenching. It's gut-wrenching. I mean, it's just, it takes a toll. It really takes a toll. And prayer is probably one of the best combatants to that kind of trauma. And to ask God to heal you, not only heal them, but heal you. And I think that played a big role. It's pretty interesting. Here's a quick story about resilience and a personal story of mine, if you would indulge me this.
Sure.
So they called me out in the middle of the night one night to work a traffic accident out on one of our big interstate highways down there, 635. You're probably familiar if you were down there much. It's kind of one of the deadliest roads probably in the country. But anyway, middle of the night, this guy was going way too fast in his BMW. Mathematically, I eventually got him at about 138 miles an hour when he lost control. He hits a light standard in the middle of the highway, demolishes the car. He sustains gruesome injuries and turns out this guy was a ex-football player for one of the NFL teams. Guy, he had been retired. Wasn't an old guy, he was a pretty young guy. Hadn't been retired long, but I didn't know him. Didn't even know who he was because it wasn't a team that I followed. But nonetheless, gruesome wreck. I get out there and I've got a 2,100 foot crime scene, which is that's a nightmare in and of itself. That'll give you PTSD. I can promise you that right there on a highway that I've got to shut down a major highway in order to investigate this crash. But it was a kind of a garden variety crash because it only involved one vehicle, and the only person that was injured and unfortunately he was killed in this wreck was the driver. But you can't assume that in the middle of the night because sure enough, the next day somebody calls and say, hey, that car that hit that BMW that lost control, did you ever catch that guy? Then if you haven't thoroughly investigated, you could be in the soup there. But so anyway, I go through this investigation. I get home. By the time I get home, it's near daylight. And it was early morning. And I go in and I'm sitting on the bed and my wife's asked me, about what happened, which was typical. And I shared usually sometimes with her. And I'm talking about this ex-football player that got killed in this car wreck. And all of a sudden I begin to sob just uncontrollably.
Wow.
And my wife's looking at me. She's never seen that. I've never really seen that either. Yeah. And she's looking at me like, what the heck? And I'm looking at her like, what the heck? And I had no idea really what was going on till after the fact. But it seemed like it wasn't meaningless because it was important to some people, but it was not something that should have affected me so dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the reality was my cup had just flowed over.
Mm-hmm.
I had taken on trauma, and I hadn't been selling it back out. I hadn't been dispelling it. I hadn't, through prayer or through counseling or through just discussion with peers,
Right.
or any, I just hadn't dispelled all that trauma. And that was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And after I had this emotional outburst, and my wife and I are both kind of looking at each other a little dumbfounded, I said, goodness gracious, this is the best I've felt in, I can't remember when.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was like liberating.
Mm-hmm.
So the reality of how trauma affects us came to light for me that day for sure.
Yeah.
And I realized I've got to be diligent about getting rid of that stress and that trauma so that it doesn't linger and doesn't have an opportunity to overflow like it did right there.
Yeah.
So, for whether you're a self-defender or a law enforcement officer or whatever, we all see trauma in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important that we work at trying to get that out. And and like I said, it could be just discussing it with a friend or somebody you trust. It could be a counselor.
Right.
But prayer, I think, is an important component to that too. I think that needs to be sprinkled on everything that we do.
I just pulled this little thing off my ankle. I wear this every single day.
Oh yeah.
So it's got a little tourniquet in it. It's got carries some duct tape, trauma shears, and then on the inside of it, I have some hemostatic gauze. And I started wearing that about 4 years ago. And fortunately, I've never had to use the tourniquet, but I've had several occasions where I've had to stop bleeding, and being able to have that hemostatic gauze. And once you start carrying it, you kind of forget about it. And then all of a sudden, oh yeah, I've got that with me. And it's actually been very handy. So we're trying to get that responsibility factor going there. If you carry a gun, carry trauma medical, know how to use it, know how to do CPR. If you're in a building, know where the AED is, because we're trying to be good, sane, sober, moral people, and that involves more than just carrying a gun.
Well, in a lot of places, Academy Sports or any of these sporting goods stores, they have pretty nice little small trauma kit or first aid kind of kits
Right.
that you can carry that have most of that stuff in them.
Mm-hmm.
That you can, like I said, you can throw it in your glove box. If you got a backpack, throw it in your backpack. They're not particularly expensive or anything.
Right.
And you can have it with you. It's what you've got is really ideal. Most people aren't, and I don't carry one on my person per se, but I always try to have something close by. Rarely am I not in my car or around my car or something where I could retrieve it if I had to. So at least if you carry, have something, familiarize yourself with what's in it and how to use it. Make sure you know how to use all that stuff. And then if you really want to go the next step, like yourself, carry something. That's a great thing. I've never seen that deal that you can actually strap it like an ankle holster.
Yeah, that's one of the things when I took over this Iowa Firearms Coalition is getting more people carrying trauma gear, teaching them the stop the bleed classes, things like that. It's actually pretty simple. It doesn't require a high level of training to, like say, put a band around somebody and crunch it down till there's no more blood spurting out. And now you've saved their life until, 4 or 5 minutes later when EMS gets there.
Correct. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
So let's, I don't want to give away the whole story, but a couple of questions I've had. Number one, let me just tell you how I got exposed to you. So I worked television weather. I was a radar severe weather tornado guy for 31 years. And I ended up becoming highly allergic to mold. And the place where I worked had some mold, and I ended up having to leave the job and get a bunch of medical treatment for about 18 months straight. So that was late in 2015, early 2016. So one of the first things when my treatment kind of was winding down was going to Omaha, Nebraska, and you guys were there with Carl Chin. And I was watching your talk, and Carl's talk and Colonel Grossman, and I was really down and out. It's like, I felt like God put me in the meteorology world because I was good at interpreting radar and getting people aware when the tornadoes were coming, exactly where they were. And it's like, what am I going to do now? Like my whole world has changed. And like, God, why did you do this? You gave me this gift of radar interpretation. Now you've taken it away. And I was angry. While I was sitting there watching Carl and then you and Colonel Grossman, and it felt like this hand came down and actually touched me on my right shoulder. And I physically turned because I thought someone had touched me from the pew behind in the church you guys were in. And this voice said, "You can do this." And it was, okay, I ran a firearms school for 10 years. I've taught thousands of students concealed carry. There is something else I can do that doesn't involve, full 8-hour days. And started working and helping churches get wired up and getting squared away on not just firearms training, but medical stuff. So it's really the Holy Spirit working through that seminar in Omaha in 2017. And I hadn't heard much about your story. It's almost, I don't know, did folks keep that quiet, or was there not a lot of news about it because of the ISIS angle, or how did Greg Stevens come to be involved in this?
Well, actually, there was a lot of news coverage internationally when it actually happened.
Right.
But Greg Stevens wasn't a part of that news coverage. The 60-year-old traffic cop, which they like to say, and I take issue with that because
right.
I was only 59. I hadn't turned,
Right.
I was a couple of weeks from my 60th birthday. So they didn't have to say 60-year-old traffic cop. But anyway, that's a whole nother story.
Right.
But they kept my name out of it, out of the coverage and so on for several months because of concerns. You got to remember in 2015, that was when ISIS was really at its pinnacle of strength and activities. So they had some definite concerns, as did I, for me and my family and the department and everybody else for that matter. So they made a very diligent effort to keep my name and the names of other officers that may have been involved out of the news and out of the media. I think most of the media people, a great thing here in Garland, we have a good relationship with our media people, and
that's good.
And I think most of the media people knew who it was, but they were gracious and kind enough to keep my name out of it because I think they realized the reality of that particular, of the danger that could incur. But then finally, a few months later, I had to go to Phoenix to testify in a trial, a subsequent trial on a co-conspirator. And the U.S. attorney put my name on the witness list for the U.S. attorney's office. And without thinking, I guess, without realizing that they were trying to keep my name out of it. And I got a call about the time I landed in Phoenix from the attorney that had represented me through this thing. He said, did you know they were going to release your name? I said, no. And he said, well, I just read it on the internet. So he said, just be aware things might change. So all of a sudden now, although I'd already been at a kind of a heightened level of concern, and that's what really brought that situational awareness component to life for not just me, but my family, because I had concerns about them as well. Right. And that's why I told them, look, you look up and see the same face more than once, or you see the same car, it's time to take that seriously. Call me, don't drive home, call me, we'll get you to a safe place. We'll get you help there, whatever. And don't feel like if it's not a real threat that you did something foolish, because it's not. Right. You got to always err on the side of caution.
Right.
But in any case, my name wasn't in it for a long time. Then once my name was released, then some people started to reach out and wanted to ask more specific, what's the word I'm looking for, the more detailed questions about what happened and those kind of things. Just like yourself and Jimmy Meeks came and found me with Sheepdog Seminars, and he and Carl Chien and Colonel Grossman have worked together for a long time, and eventually I just became part of that group, and we've worked together ever since, still doing some things together.
Okay, that's good. It's a good group of guys there.
Oh,
So when we have you to Iowa for our Second Amendment Day, we're going to have you kind of tell that story in, I don't know, 30-minute version or something like that. But number one, I don't think a lot of people realize I spent part of the winter in Phoenix, that those terrorists actually came from Phoenix and traveled to Garland. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's they drove to Garland. The event we were having there at the Curtiss Culwell Center. Now, the Curtiss Culwell Center is owned by the school district. It's a big arena type basketball kind of facility with a nice big conference center off of it. It's a great facility. I think it holds about 10,000 people. So they do some sporting events and other events there, graduations, that kind of stuff. And the conference center is busy a lot. And the event they were having was sponsored by a lady named Pamela Geller out of New York. And it was a Draw the Prophet art contest, which was in response to the Charlie Hebdo attacks in France and some other things where the Muslim terrorists were wreaking havoc worldwide. And her feeling was that freedom of speech was being threatened here, and that we needed to have something to show that we weren't going to kowtow to their intimidation and so on and so forth, and picked Garland, Texas. And that was based on another event that had happened a few months prior to that, which was controversial in Garland. And so that's how she picked Garland, Texas. So we have this event now that we have to provide security for, that is an event that is offensive to the whole Muslim community,
right?
And which is a large community in the Garland, Dallas, Richardson area, so we had obviously deep concerns, and it offered us some challenges we had never faced before.
So the encapsulated story, I don't want to give too much away, but you guys are squared away. You've got lots of officers there, lots of eyes on things, and they put you, what was it, the VIP entrance, where supposedly that would be quiet and shouldn't see anything, go home, have a good night. Didn't quite work out that way, right?
Well, when I signed up for the thing, I had no idea what it was, first of all, which shame on me for not asking somebody, I guess. But it was a Sunday afternoon, and it was 5 hours of overtime. So I signed up for 5 hours of easy overtime. That's what I signed up for. Not exactly what I got. And I didn't even, until just before the event, I still had no idea what the Draw the Prophet art contest was. I wasn't involved at all in the planning or any of that kind of thing. But my assignment was really kind of off to one side. It was the west entrance. I was the only officer there. I had a security guard there with me that was unarmed, that was in a uniform, but it was a security uniform, and he wasn't armed. The rest of the perimeter and the main entrance and all that was fortified with all the officers there were either SWAT team members or they were patrol officers that were rifle trained and rifle qualified, and they all had rifles deployed. Some of them were kitted out in their SWAT gear. The rest were in their regular police uniforms, but had their rifles deployed. Pretty obvious presence, an aggressive presence of police for this event, except for me. And I didn't have a rifle, and it was just me and my Glock 21 45 caliber pistol and my unarmed security guard. And as it turns out, that was where they decided they would breach the perimeter, or attempt to breach the perimeter.
You think they had intel that was going to be the softest target, or how do you think they picked that?
You know, I don't have any solid evidence that this is the case, but somehow I got a feeling if you drove all the way from Phoenix, the very first policeman that you saw near that building wouldn't be the place that you would stop. Right. That you would drive by, look the place over, figure out what your plan was, and formulate a plan. And after driving through and looking at how the rest of the facility was fortified, maybe think back, go, you know, that first place, there was just one guy there. There was a security guard there and a policeman, you know, one policeman there, and heck, he was 100 years old. How hard could this be? Right?
59.
59, yeah. Wasn't 60, by the way.
So obviously the intent wasn't just to take out an officer and an ISD security guard. It was to get inside the building. Would you say that's right?
Yeah, and I think what their plan ended up being is they were going to breach the perimeter where I was on foot and make their way on foot to the entrance, to the conference center entrance, which was across a pretty large parking lot. But you got two guys spread out. It might be pretty hard to acquire them really quickly, in a surprise, what should have been a surprise attack, I guess. Mm-hmm. And it happened just as the event ended. So I think their idea was to get to the entrance and have that fatal funnel to work with and take as much life as they possibly could.
Right. So the two guys get out of the car. Was the passenger first, then the driver? Is that how it went?
They got out about at the same time.
Okay.
And both doors opened about the same time, and I can see the passenger side where the car is located, and I'll describe that a little more in detail on the 24th of February. But anyway, I could see the passenger side better. I engaged him first, the passenger second, re-engaged the driver second, re-engaged the passenger, and then had to re-engage the driver again before help was able to get there. And we're only talking a matter of seconds, probably between 10 and 15 seconds for the whole encounter with both assailants.
Did you in the stressful things I've encountered in the aviation world, I've actually had like the time dilation where things kind of like slow down and I could like see little things that I might normally miss. Did you experience anything like that as they started pulling up on you with AK-47s?
It didn't really. I don't remember it slowing down per se. I did experience auditory exclusion though, and probably most of your audience is familiar with what that is, but that's where you kind of lose the ability to hear sounds. But it sounded like muffled automatic weapon fire to me, as I recall, and I really could feel and see my weapon, my pistol operating more than I could hear it, which is kind of an interesting phenomenon, but I don't remember it slowing down per se. But I do remember a couple of things, and I'll talk about this on the 24th, having a sight picture on every round, my rate of fire, some of those things, and I'll talk in a little more detail about that and how that relates to training.
Right. Were you concentrating on, upper high chest? Did you have to go to the head box? Can you talk about any of that at all?
I did exactly what I was trained to do. I shot center of mass. The guys that were wearing body armor, they had load-bearing vests with multiple magazines in them. But then there's some stories behind that. I don't want to get in great detail here, but the reality is the rounds were effective. And I didn't have to go to a failure type situation where I had to try to do headshots. I fired center of mass like we're trained to do, and it was effective. So, once again, the Lord's looking out for me. And, I got two assailants I'm dealing with. I have no cover.
And no help, apparently.
Well, not at first. Some of the SWAT guys, they came a running, but like I said, this event, from the time you hear shots fired to the time somebody's actually there is 10 and 15 seconds. It was, they were both down by then. But it wasn't out of a lack of trying. I mean, my guys came a running, and God bless them for that. And I love those guys and appreciate them worrying about me.
Did you feel anything, like Williford talks about it, like he felt the Holy Spirit take over and calm him down and, so he could make precise shots? Did anything like that enter, or is it just like, okay, I've gone to my training is taken over and doing its thing?
More than anything for me, it was, I didn't have to formulate a plan. I didn't have to decide what I was going to do. I just did what I did, because that's what I had trained to do. And you got to remember, I was a 37-year veteran at the time that this occurred. and never had to discharge my firearm in the line of duty up to that point.
Wow.
But I had been to the range many times, and we had an emphasis on training. In the unit I worked in, the traffic unit, we had a lot of guys that did also duties with SWAT and the bomb unit, and of course the motorcycle unit, all high training emphasis kinds of endeavors. So we did a lot of extra firearms training. There were days when the traffic unit went out to the range and we just had a firearms training day because we could. And those, we practiced interesting things. One of the things we practiced was firing on multiple targets. And a lot of people don't practice that. They don't train for that. They don't, think about the possibility of that. And sure enough, what the heck? Here I got 2 targets I got to deal with that are moving and are in different places. Yeah, I didn't. And I'll talk about this briefly on the 24th, but be real honest with you, it did feel after, and it was really more after the fact. It seemed like God had reached down, put his hand on my shoulder and said, I'm going to protect you, but you got to do something with these guys.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that's, like I said, I didn't have a cognizant feeling of that then. Like I said, it was more after the fact when I realized that how important God's presence is in everything that we do, and it's by His grace and to His glory that I'm here today. And
yes,
I honestly
absolutely
believe that.
Well, I can't thank you enough. Appreciate that you're going to come to Iowa, and as long as weather and flight delays and all that work out, so we'll have a good crowd to hear that story, and just the role of faith and the fact that God can use your entire career for one moment. So never doubt that if you're in something and it's a grind day to day and you wonder, like, what is God doing with me? What is this plan? You don't know. You may end up like Greg Stevens and save the day and save potentially, hundreds of lives of that event. So I just want to encourage folks to keep that in mind and come out to join us on the 24th in Iowa. It's going to be at the rotunda of the Iowa State Capitol from 2 to 4, and then we'll have a little steak dinner that night as well. So, Greg, anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up? We've kept you longer than I said I would.
It's okay. It's been my pleasure. I've really enjoyed the visit. Can I close with one thing?
You bet.
And this is why we train and why it's so imperative that we train. Rarely do we get to choose the moment. It chooses us. And there's no way to know when that moment might happen. And thus, being prepared is the only combat we have for that. And training is the only way we can be prepared.
All right. Prepare for the moment. You don't choose the moment chooses you. So folks, write that down, carry it with you, and use it as a way to prepare yourself every single day before you walk out of the house. So, Greg, thank you very much again, and we'll see you soon in Iowa.
Well, it's my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to getting up there.